So then, what is the future of the G8? For that matter, what is the future of the G20 and symmetry altogether? A hill-to-hill segment now. Colin Robertson in Ottawa, former senior Canadian diplomat in the United States, and joining us from Washington is Chris Sands, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Welcome to you both. Good to have you back on the show again. And Chris, let me start with you. Expectations for this summit. We've already seen, because it's been leaked, the final communique of the G8 group. Haven't seen the final communique of the G20 yet. But does it lead to some cynicism that we've already made the conclusions of the meeting before anybody's even arrived here? And thus, what is the point of this?
Well, I think expectations have to be low for this summit for three reasons. One, the global economy is in real trouble, so the problems they have to address are huge. Secondly, there's very little consensus among the governments of the G8 or the G20 on what they should do to turn the economy around. A lot of different ideas out there, no real consensus that's shaped up in the months leading up to the summit. And lastly, there are a lot of distractions. A new Japanese government, the British government relatively new, the Greek, now Hungarian financial crises in Europe, and of course for the Americans, midterm elections and BP oil spills. There's a lot of other issues out there that are going to be distracting the leaders. So I think that we have to have low expectations going in, that there's going to be a breakthrough here, but maybe some early progress towards something down the road.
Colin, Chris makes a good point. I mean, everybody's coming in here not necessarily singing off the same page, and they've overwhelmed with their own domestic situations. Can we really expect that summits are going to be the vehicle that can have everybody pulling in the same direction for more than 5 hours at a time?
Yeah, Tom, summits are about leaders getting together informally, although these things increasingly become more and more contrived, and getting to know one another, and with hope that as they get to know one another, they can then pick up the phone and make the decisions that need to be made because they know each other. And as Chris points out, there's some new players in here from Britain and Japan. There's certainly lots on the agenda. My own sense is that this G8 is going to move towards a G20 simply because the G20 is so much more representative of the critical players now. It represents 80% of the world's GDP, and as you point out, China isn't there. So I think this may well be the swan song for the G8.
Chris, back to you for a second. Here in Canada, the coverage of these summits, I mean, except, for some spending that seems a little bit odd for the reasons Colin's talking about, that these things seem to have gotten out of control a little bit. But nevertheless, when you take a look here in Canada, the coverage basically is Canada is driving the agenda for the G8. In the real world, does that really happen, that Canada drives an international agenda?
Well, no. I mean, it's not that Canada couldn't. Canada's going to be a wonderful host, but usually these summits hinge on a U.S., European, U.S. other big power deal to move things forward. We used to see this between the United States and the European countries at the WTO, or before that at the GATT. The original purpose of getting together at G7 was to talk currency, and we do have real problems with the euro falling and the American dollar falling and the Chinese refusing to devalue. But we aren't using the G8 for that anymore, and I think you're right, maybe China will make a good member just from a currency point of view. The G20, the whole idea there was to start talking about a more equitable sort of set of world rules, and I think that we've seen a lot of G20 members, not necessarily the old G8 like Canada or even the US, but a lot of the new members pushing the agenda of the broader G20 and really asking developed countries to give them a seat at the table in terms of trade, but also so that they can pursue export-led growth and build their own economies up. With the weakness of developed country economies and low consumer spending, I think even they have low expectations that this year is going to be a big breakthrough. But at the end, you just keep meeting, you do establish relationships, and you hope that maybe next year or the year after that, it'll be ripe for some sort of resolution or moving forward. And so you won't lose anything this year. I think you just might not want to expect anything really big.
Do you mean nobody is going to want to follow the Canadian example to get out of this economic mess?
Well, the Canadian model, I think, is unique in a lot of ways. I mean, it's a good economy, for sure, and it's doing very well, but it's so commodity-driven. It has more in common with some of the developing countries on commodities. Then, on the other hand, in terms of fiscal balance, it's in a unique position, a very good fiscal policy, taxes moving in a downward direction. That's something that Europe and the United States would love to have, but we're not there. So I think in some ways Canada will be a source of envy, but in other ways, people will look at Canada and say, we're not enough like Canada to follow the the Canadian model. So good for them, but no fake lakes for us.
Colin, what about that? I mean, I don't want to get distracted by some of the smaller stuff, but boy, the smaller stuff is getting bigger. When these G7s, when they were originally G5s and then got up to G7 and then G8, when they started, I think the whole idea was sort of a more relaxed, easygoing type of meeting. We're now up to spending over $1 billion just for security, and then we're building fake lakes and we're building outhouses in the bush that nobody will ever do and so on. I mean, at what point do these things just get out of hand and become ridiculous?
Well, you could argue that we're fast approaching that. In many ways, this could have been an opportunity. If you think back to the first summit that we hosted at Montebello, when Pierre Trudeau had been admitted, they by design ratcheted it right back. So Montebello was one leader and I think 15 other officials. Then there was a whole panoply living in Ottawa, but they really pulled it back to create that informality that the leaders really strive for. This one will be quite different. And you also got to remember that when the G5, G6, G7 began, these were very much economic focused, which is where the G20 is now. Over time, the G8 as it's become, which is really G8 plus about 5, 6 others, have become slightly more political, but increasingly the two agendas are melding together. So the distinction between G8 and G20, I think they're pretty much going to come together on this one. So by the time we get Seoul, and certainly by next year, they may have come together.
Chris, just a last thought, and Colin sort of touched on it a little bit. It seems to me that there's almost an industry in summitry now that exists in all governments. It chews up an enormous amount of money, and I'm just wondering whether, in reality, can you stop this beast? I mean, when there's this industry out there that has to be fed every year, how on earth do you finally say, well, we've had enough or we're going to scale it back?
I don't know. This is something that's really exploded, and I think it goes to the end of the Cold War when the U.S. was this unipolar power and joined every club around the world, and then all of a sudden there were summits and everyone had to be more spectacular than the last. It's almost like the Olympics now. They've turned into big shows, and without that sort of underlying virtue of sport. It's too bad. I think that Colin's right. The leaders will continue to crave smaller summits, but I just don't know if we'll get there. The Americans typically bring 500-600 people. We can't be cozy at those kind of numbers, and I think a lot of the leaders will start saying, if I keep going to meetings, seeing the same faces and getting nothing done, I might as well stay at home.
Okay. Chris Sands, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington. Colin Robertson joining us here in Ottawa. Thanks to you both, as always. Good to have you on.